Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Affairs. I'm Philip Young, President and CEO, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us for today's program, which is about taking action on rising waters in the San Francisco Bay. I'm particularly pleased to be opening the program for two reasons. First, for those of you joining us from the Bay Area, I want to celebrate, the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions and our emergence from, the incredible difficulties and the heartbreaking loss of the past 16 months. For us at World Affairs, there's great hope that all of that is behind us, but I have to admit there's some trepidation about, what the future may bring. But secondly, I'm excited because today's conversation is part of a signature program series we're calling World Affairs in Action. And it marks a new beginning, in a sense, of the direction of our organization, one that really, in a nutshell, focuses on insight, action, and purpose. We at World Affairs know that insight and knowledge are important to you. Facts matter. And that in this upside down world, you want to be proactive now, and you want to do something that makes a difference on issues like climate change. And I think this is more the case that we've been sequestered in for such a long time. So this series, World Affairs in Action, has been created with you all in mind. We're striving to give our members, friends, attendees, concrete opportunities to be part of local solutions that we hope will be an example for others elsewhere. In other words, what we do here can scale. And that's what I think we're trying to do with these sort of events. And this event that we have is not one-off. It's not a one-off. No. With the help from our partners, like the ones that we have here, Bay Area Council and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, we intend to create an ongoing and regular place and space for those of you who want to do more over the coming months and year. In a sense, to join an active community with a common purpose. So please check your inbox after today's program. We're going to be sending you a short packet of information about sea level rise and ways to get involved and be part of a push to protect our local coastal communities. And I also want you to look for more follow-up from us directly later about more sort of groups that we're going to be putting together about this particular issue. So with that, let's go to the program. I have the great pleasure of introducing today's host, Ezra David Ramiro, who I've known by voice, and now I'm seeing him for the first time, is a climate reporter at KQED. He covers the absence and access of water in the Bay Area. And if you want to know what that means, think sea level rise, flooding, and drought. So with that, David, please go ahead. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. It's great to be here. It's great to be in the Bay Area. I've been here for about 3.5 months. Before then, I was in Sacramento. And I'd like to welcome our guests. Today, we're joined by Mike Milke. He's the Senior Vice President and Head of Public Policy at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And Adrian Covert, he's the Vice President of Public Policy for the Bay Area Council. They've both been working on public policy challenges for the Bay Area brought on by climate change for a long time. So I just want to say welcome to both of you guys. Thanks for joining us. And for people who are listening, as we go along, feel free to ask questions throughout the time, and we'll do our best to answer them. Put them in the chat box, and we may interject them throughout my questions, and we'll have, at the end of this, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of public comment period where you can ask questions. So guys, I want to start off at the very beginning. Almost every part of the Bay has been altered by people, right? There's cities around the entire Bay, there's infrastructure, there's bridges. What did the Bay look like before there were scores of people here? How's it changed over time? Go ahead.
Who first?
Adrian, sure.
Okay. First, thanks, Ezra. Great to be here with you and Mike and Philip and Carla and World Affairs. Thanks for inviting us. Looking forward to the chat. How's the Bay changed over the last 150 years or so? Well, I think there's two big things. One, it was lower and it was larger, right? So lower, the Bay's actually risen about 8 inches over the last century. So when we talk about sea level rise, we should know that we're already in the middle of it. The Golden Gate has got the oldest tidal gauge in the United States, going back to about the 1850s. So we actually have got some great data on this. On the fact that it was larger, at the start of the gold rush, there were about 210,000 acres of wetland habitat that wrung the San Francisco Bay shoreline. And by 1960, it had been reduced to about 30,000 acres. And in between the gold rush in the 1960s, the bay was often used little more than as a dumpster. People enthusiastically filled in the bay. Garbage went in the bay. For a long time, there was untreated sewage that went into the bay. If you look at most of the old wealthy homes in the Bay Area, they're located on hills away from the dreadful stench of what the bay used to be like. It was an unpleasant place. And then that kind of culminates in the early 1960s, and the Army Corps of Engineers put out this amazing map proposing to fill the bay all the way almost to the middle, doubling the size of Berkeley, basically to Yerba Buena Island, to Treasure Island, which of course spawned a public backlash and a movement to start saving San Francisco Bay. And we've been adding wetland habitat back to it since. I think we're about up to 60,000 acres now. So in short, it used to be lower and it used to be bigger, but we filled it in, and in a couple pockets, we're starting to return some of that back to nature.
Mike, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I want to echo Adrian's thanks. It's great to be here with you, Ezra and Adrian, for this conversation, important conversation about what we can all do about the sea level rise. Actually, rising waters, we should talk about that, because it's not just the waters rising at the shore's edge, but the other rising waters we'll touch on hopefully later in the program. And thanks to Philip and Carla and the whole team at World Affairs. I think that's really well said. But if you think about it in terms of the size, so the report that Adrian mentioned that the Corps put forward was really looking at shrinking the bay to the size of no more than a shipping channel, right? So the bay, under that scenario would have shrunk to just a vestigial, piece or small little part of what it once was. We're now less than 2/3 of what the historic size was, right? Historic, it depends when you look at, because obviously over the geologic time scales, we're looking at seas rising and falling over hundreds of thousands of years. But basically since this area was settled, we're looking at a size of about 2/3 of what it once was. And a lot of that is because of that infill, and because we have built right up to the water's edge, and in some cases into the water, right? Built right into the bay, which exacerbates this problem that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, think of the Treasure Island right on the bridge there, places like that where infill was put, and now we have an island and we have problems with sea level rise. Let's fast forward to today and talk about sea level rise. And there's climate change, right? The world has changed since San Francisco was founded, and now nearly 8 million people live in the Bay Area, and many more drive in here every day. As the world warms and the climate crisis continues, exactly how much sea level rise is forecast for the Bay Area? What's our future going to look like?
Yeah, so I mean, even though we've had the unprecedented, in modern times at least, economic shutdown that was largely forced by the pandemic over the past year and a half or so, depending on where you are. I mean, the level of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere are at their highest level ever. So we've still got this problem. It's continuing apace, and in many cases, it's accelerating. And scientific understanding of sea level rise, is advancing at a rapid pace, and a lot of it is really dependent upon, these scenarios of what we're going to do to slow adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So the most recent set of estimates recently released by the California Ocean Protection Council, it's got probabilistic projections for 2050, looking at a likely level of about 1 foot range by 2050. By 2100, really the probable range skews over a very wide amount. could be 40 inches to as much as 80 inches. And of course, a lot of that depends on what happens to these huge ice sheets, right? That still cover an appreciable part of the globe. And as the temperatures in the waters continue to rise. Another thing for us to consider is, and this is less talked about, and it's a smaller amount, but it all adds up, is the fact that there's subsidence. So the region is slowly subsiding for a variety of regions as well. So we're slowly sinking, right, as the waters are rising. So it's kind of compounding all of that.
So there's a lot happening at once. Adrian, you want to add anything about what climate models predict for the region we live in?
Yeah, sure. So, citing the same figures that Mike was just referring to, these are from the Ocean Protection Council. I mentioned that in the last century, we had about 8 inches of rise. The best science now is estimating that we're going to see 4 to 6 inches by 2030. And that's based off of just a few years ago. So we could be seeing similar amounts of rise from the last 100 years in about 15. The less probabilistic 1 in 200 scenarios, though, are pretty shocking. You're looking at by the end of the century, up to 10 feet in the worst case scenario, which would be pretty devastating. And then by 2050, yeah, you're looking at 7 to 13 inches and maybe up to several feet by mid-century. But an important thing to remember about these projections is that these are clear weather projections, right? So on a sunny day, how much rise are you going to get when you're driving across the bridge and you can observe on the bay? That's not really an accurate representation of what the risk is. The danger is what happens when you get 4, 5, 6 inches of rise, and then you get a significant extreme storm event on top of tidal surge and a few more inches from a king tide and a few more inches from runoff from heavy rainfall. That's when you start getting, you start seeing impacts add up. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, a few years ago, the Bay Area Council did an analysis, a report called Surviving the Storm, where we analyzed a 150-year storm event and what would happen to the Bay Area, assuming present day sea levels. We estimated the damages would be conservatively estimated around $10.5 billion, which is about the same amount of damage as the Loma Prieta earthquake. When we were doing interviews with major infrastructure, agencies that manage major infrastructure along the Bay shoreline, we were having a discussion with Valley Water in Santa Clara Valley, and they have water purification facilities that are right on the Bay shoreline. And we went through the data with them on the storm that we projected and the amount of storm surge, et cetera. And they said, this storm wouldn't impact our facilities if it hit today, but if it hit in 2030, it would. So that's the kind of impact that we're going to see. Things that are relatively safe today are going to be less and less so with every inch of rise.
Yeah, if we can add to that, just Ezra, just real quick to the rising waters point. So it's not just the water's edge that we have to worry about. It's also the fact that the water table is also rising, right? As the sea level rises, they rise together. And rivers, creeks, and streams. So as the weather increasingly becomes variable and is disrupted by all these heat trapping gases in the atmosphere, we can expect the same or more amount of precipitation, often in shorter time periods. And so we're also worried about river, creek, and stream flooding. So it's really rising waters of all types all around us that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, there's this compounding issue that comes with climate change, wetter wets, right? Drier dries. If you have questions for the audience, you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We can ask them throughout the time. Any question is good at this point. So, if 10 feet by 2100 is a lot, 7 inches could also have a big impact. A lot of these things could impact bridges and sewer lines and water treatment plants you guys were talking about, and the list keeps on going. How much of the Bay Area's 9 counties are at risk of inundation. Like, what's at stake? What are we looking at under these models?
Yeah, so on the 10-foot, this is the H++ scenario from the OPC. Just to be clear, it's less than a 1 in 200 probability at this point. So that is kind of the outlier estimate. Though the impacts of a 10-foot level sea level rise would be so cataclysmic that 1 in 200 is really narrow, far closer than you want it to be. If that were to happen, the lowest lying areas in the bay are in Santa Clara County and along the San Mateo County shoreline and in parts of Marin. You would see 10 feet, you would see utter devastation. Parts of San Francisco, the Soma, Mission Bay would be gone. Communities in Marin and Alameda counties too. Possibly the biggest impact would be the city of Sacramento, which is below sea level, right at sea level. So you would get flooding, inland away from of the ocean as well. I think it might be helpful though, or part of the study that we did a few years ago looked at and quantified the assets that are in the more traditional 100-year floodplain. So far short of the impacts of a 10-foot rise, just what's in our 100-foot storm inundation zone includes major infrastructure. We're talking about 35 schools, 15 hospitals, 6 fire departments, 5 police stations, 800 miles of roadways, 68 miles of rail, 46 wastewater treatment plants processing 800 million gallons per day of sewage, and 3 power plants generating electricity for 2.25 million Bay Area households. So this is about shared infrastructure that touches everyone's life in the Bay Area. A lot of it's on the Bay shoreline, and we don't need 10 feet of rise for that to face significant threats.
Mike, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's well said. The only thing to add is, I guess it depends on how broad your scope is, right? So Adrian mentioned Sacramento, which is something that's not often talked about. So kudos for doing that. We're talking about hundreds of thousands to well over 1 million residents, right? With today's population, the Bay Area is still, writ large, is still continuing to grow. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars of infrastructure. And again, that's under sort of this frog in the slowly, boiling water scenario, much less all of that going on with the king tide coupled with a major storm, that we can see, which is not uncommon here in California in terms of a atmospheric river or something like that. So there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at risk for sure, all across the region.
Yeah, and a certain a certain amount of climate change or warming temperatures are already baked in, right? Like it's going to happen because pollutants are already out in the atmosphere, right? From what I understand. And so we had someone ask, thank you for your important program. How have the odds changed in the last 5 years for rise levels? So I think they're asking, like, have the odds gone up that this is going to happen?
Oh yeah, basically the long and short of it, I don't know the exact how to quantify it, but the more greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the further and the faster the waters will rise. It's that simple.
The latest that we have on this, the best baseline we have to go off of how the emissions are going to affect California so far is the Ocean Protection Council estimate. And everyone knows it's like all climate science modeling. It's imperfect. This is, we're doing the best, science is doing the best that it can to create reasonable estimates. The important thing is that we have a reasonable estimate that planners can react to and builders can react to. I think the important thing is that when we put plans in place, whether it's a new levee or a new seawall along the Embarcadero, that the infrastructure that we're building is adaptive and it's able to expand based on the realities on the ground.
Yeah, obviously we've talked about how much risk there is, to places like Silicon Valley, to around the Bay, all the way to Sacramento. This is a regional issue. Kind of what I'm hearing you all say is that the Bay Area's very identity is at risk, right? We have this idea we're this tech capital, all these people live here. You know, there's a lot going on here in California. The way we live, how we get around, or even who can live here is going to be challenged. But this idea of curbing the impacts of sea level rise isn't new to the Bay Area, right? And I think we're also a leader at the same time, even though we have all this problems going on. So let's talk about what's being done so far in a way that benefits all Bay Area residents, not just the people who can afford to make change. What's going on around, what's positive momentum around this so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff happening. There's, Foster City a few years ago, I think it was 2018, passed a bond measure P to deal with that. That really, a lot of folks saw that as a canary in the coal mine kind of moment because they were facing the imminent risk because, Foster City, as mentioned earlier, is literally built right into the bay on a lot of infill. And so they were really up against it. And so you have efforts like that are going on. You have regional and sub-regional efforts. So on the sub-regional level, there's the Safer Project, and that's a collaborative effort here in San Mateo County where I live. I live in Redwood City. That's got a bunch of different partners from all different sectors, including the business sector and PG&E and local groups. That's really looking to help the region from, Redwood City, Menlo Park area down south to Palo Alto, Mountain View, and San Francisco Creek. And they're looking to provide protection, against the sea level rise. This scenario that we've talked about a couple of times, of about 10 foot. And it would provide other benefits, including, habitat restoration and along former salt ponds, and focus on, generating jobs and economic opportunities locally. There's also an effort that Adrian and I and a huge cross section of other folks from different sectors are a part of, and that's the Bay Adapt initiative that's being led by the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. BCDC is maybe an acronym folks have heard, but may not know much about. And that was, that institution was created about 50 years ago, and it was the nation's first, I believe, coastal zone agency to help protect and manage the resources along the bay. And this Bay Adapt initiative that they've been working on for a number of months, it's multi-stakeholder, and they're looking to establish, regional agreements on actions necessary to protect the region from rising waters. They're developing guiding principles, looking to put forward a joint platform and get some agreement about that joint platform and the commitment to act together. It's a huge effort. It's a Herculean thing because we're talking about 9 counties, 101 cities, and a smorgasbord of different institutions, agencies, et cetera, that have some say on development going forward. So it's a big effort, and that's moving forward right now.
Yeah, Mike, how's that going? I've only been in San Francisco for 3.5 months, and I put together a list of all the water agencies involved or doing water stuff, and it's like over 150 entities. Like, how is that process going with BCDC so far in this regional collaboration? Are we making headway?
I'm happy to add to that, but I've been chatting a bit here. Adrian, you want to take that up?
Sure. Well, I think in the next few months, the results of the BCDC process are going to be unveiled, and then the community and the public will have a chance to react to it. It's a lot to chew. The Bay Area is 101 cities and 9 counties, and the business community, community-based organizations don't always see eye to eye on what the best strategies are to accomplish big things, whether it's defending the region against rising sea levels, or our housing policies or our transportation policies. But I've got to hand it to BCDC staff that they're putting in the work to bring everyone to the table to get something passed. In terms of kind of where the region stands relative to the rest of the United States, Mike and I went to the U.S. National Estuary Conference a few years ago, and the good news is that the Bay Area is seen as being leagues ahead of other coastal regions of the United States on this question.
Yeah.
The bad news is that that's inadequate. on a couple other things that we've been doing that other regions haven't, where we're ahead, is that in 2016, 70% of Bay Area voters approved Measure AA. Remember, this was a $12 parcel tax that will raise $500 million over the next 20 years on wetland restoration and flood protection projects, including new levees ringing the shoreline where attached to restoration projects. This is a first measure of its kind. I don't know of anything quite like it in the United States. And it gives the Bay Area a lot of leverage to get state funding and federal funding, which we're working on right now. And I'm hoping it by the end of this call, we'll have like an call to action. And there are some things that folks can do to help that along the way. The other thing that we did recently, is speeding up the amount of time it takes to get sea level rise projects, particularly marsh restoration projects, in the ground. You got to navigate local, state, and federal bureaucracies to get shovels in the dirt. And it could take 5 to 10 years to get these projects permitted. And the fact is, we don't have that kind of time, especially if we want to use some of the cost-effective nature-based solutions that are currently at our within reach now. But if we let the seas get too high before we start these projects and get them in the ground, they won't be cost-effective anymore. So we have a short time to get some of these projects in the ground. And what Mike and I and others did a few years ago was help start this initiative called the Bay Regional Restoration Integration Team. And so that's an alphabet soup called BRIT. And what it does is it takes these multi-benefit restoration projects and it creates a permit fast track for them. It's still the same rigorous amount of analysis that goes into any permitting project, but you get all the permitting agencies in the room together, and they can deliberate a project right then and there together. And we've been able to shrink down the permitting time to about a year. So we're hoping that the Bay Area voters have entrusted public leaders with a significant amount of funding to get projects around the Bay implemented that are going to have sea level rise benefits. And then we went ahead and reduced the amount of permitting time it takes to get those projects in the ground. So we're making progress, more still yet to be done.
Yeah, if you have any
That's
questions.
well said. If I could add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's really important to think about, we need a variety of solutions. It's a silver buckshot, not silver bullet. There's a lot of different things, and it depends where in the Bay you are because of just geography, like how the land is, how close to the Bay you are, how deep it is, and you can also think about the Bay like a big bathtub. And so these nature-based solutions, which get away from this idea of hard sides, right? If we have too many hard sides, then we're going to really have a problem, because the water is going to really go to the weakest point if that's the way that we're tackling this problem. We've got to look at an all the above strategy where we're doing gray infrastructure, but we're also doing these nature-based solutions, which Adrian had mentioned. And really after 2030, because of what the science is telling us, after that, it's going to be too hard, too expensive to get these nature-based solutions in the ground, so to speak, and have them take root. So that is right there. It's we're less than 9 years away from that 2030 deadline, right? We also, I think, to this point about we're ahead of a lot of the US, while that may be great and we should pat ourselves in the back just a tad, we got a lot of work to do. You look to the Dutch. They've been living with this problem for a long time. What they're doing is they're not just trying to keep the waters at bay, they're letting the waters in. They've created lakes and catchments like garages, parks, plazas that provide multiple values, right? They're public spaces, or they're part of the way that you get around and where you're going to leave your car and other kinds of things. But they also double as water catchment, and so they're building up. And they're also, they're figuring out ways to work with the water. And that's a lot of time, it's a lot of planning, and that's a lot of money to go towards that. And some places will be able to do that. Some places will have to build seawalls. Some places will rely more on these nature-based solutions. It's really an above, all of the above kind of a strategy that we've got to look at here.
Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Jared asked this question. He says, given the range of baseline sea level rise, as well as the compounding event-based issues like heavy storms, king tides, et cetera, what do we actually need to prepare for with changes to our Bay Area infrastructures like seawalls? How big do they need to be, and how distributed across the bay? I mean, I worked on a little bit story about this recently, and there is, where we put these is important, right? Like, because the water can shift to different communities, so it has to be equitable. Can you guys tell me a little bit about that? Like, why is it important, and how big do these things need to be?
Well, I think it depends.
That's a great question. You know, I'm not.
Oh, go ahead, please.
You know, it's a great question, and it depends on the landscape of that you're trying, the infrastructure you're trying to protect, the part of the bay. Certain parts of the bay are more vulnerable to local surge flows than others, or runoff flows than others. Santa Clara County, for example, very vulnerable to riverine flooding behind the bay shoreline just as much as it is from the bay. I believe the most important thing is that we look at the lifespan of what's being built. Most bridges, housing projects are built to last about 100 years. And so we need to look at what the projection is over the course of 100 years, and make sure that whatever that project is being built to, there's flexibility to ramp up the defense if needed. So we're not stuck with a bunch of damaged assets if the projections are more severe, end up being more severe than what we're currently projecting them to be.
So both of you have worked in the world of policy, and dealing with sea level rise is really expensive, right? These projects are millions of dollars, and all of them together could be billions of dollars to prepare the bay. What's the problem so far on the policy end? How involved does the state of California need to be in this as well? I mean, it's a layered approach, right? Because there's, the state depends on this area as well.
Yeah, so perhaps this will be part of the call to action later, I hope, but it is very expensive. And I remember Senator Feinstein came to my former CEO years ago, I want to say back in 2014 or so, or even maybe 2013, and said, I really need you to focus on this idea of protecting the bay from rising waters. And she'd done a lot to put some land that was in the South Bay in the right hands, so that we could then work to protect it, preserve it, enhance it for the region's benefit, for the SF Bay's health, but also for the protection of all the assets that we've been talking about right at the water's edge and behind it. And we were looking at back then about $1.5 billion just for the sort of green infrastructure that we're talking about, without getting into all this gray infrastructure at the water's edge and then back from it. And then to what Adrian had talked about back in 2016, 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago, we passed that measure in June of 2016. First of its kind, basically, regional adaptation measure that was overwhelmingly supported by voters. Over 70% of the 9-county Bay Area voted to protect the region and enhance the waters along the San Francisco Bay. And that's raising $500 million over 20 years. It went into effect in 2018. There's projects that are going into the ground all the time. Thankfully, that process is being sped along by the BRIT that Adrian had so well covered a few moments ago. And so now we're looking to matching funds, right? Because that was always the idea, is there was kind of a 3-layer cake. So we would do our part first, what was Measure AA, right? And that would be the first layer. And then we get a state match, and then we get a federal match. There's efforts underway right now to do that, both at the state level and at the federal level.
And there's been talk this past week in articles and letters to the editor to different papers about how the budget doesn't have enough money in it for sea level rise projects. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Is that true?
So over the past several years, Mike and I and others, including partners of ours in the environmental community, have been pressing state legislators for an expanded commitment to match what the Bay Area voters and taxpayers have already put towards restoring the Bay. So we're currently pressing for a $300 million state match this budget cycle. And there's receptivity to it in Sacramento, but nothing's done yet. And so those are ongoing discussions on the state side. On the federal side, there's our representative, Jackie Spear, has authored HR 610, which recently cleared the House. It's now in the Senate. And it would essentially 10x the amount of funding the Bay gets from the federal government. Despite being the largest estuary on the West Coast, the San Francisco Bay gets about $5 million a year from the EPA's Estuaries Program, which is the program that funding like these projects would go through, which is far less than much smaller estuaries elsewhere in the United States, like Puget Sound or Chesapeake Bay. So we're trying to correct that historic inadequacy of Bay funding, and we've never been closer. So I know there'll be a call to action, but to preview that now, Senators Feinstein and Padilla have a big role to play on the federal side. And then on the budget side, Assemblymember Ting and Senator Skinner have a big role to play in funding for the Bay for sea level rise defense here in the next few days with the California budget.
Yeah, one more question for me, and then we'll talk about this call to action. What do we not know about sea level rise that we should know, or what are your thoughts around that? I mean, we've said that there's gaps in the science, there's probabilities, there's not all communities are fighting sea level rise at the same rate. What do we not know that we want to know around how sea level rise is going to affect this place we live in?
Well, I don't think, again, it's not just sea level rise, it's all of it, right? So it's the groundwater and it's the rivers, creeks, and streams. I don't know that, I mean, there's so much inherent in this process of modeling this kind of stuff. It's so complex, so difficult, and I'm certainly not a scientist, and I never play one on TV either. It's just really, dependent upon, and part of the call to action, I really think is slowing the rate of adding these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, because everything that we do here to adapt to not only rising waters, but to wildfires, it's going to get really hot. It's getting hot now. It's going to get hot later in the week. Dealing with increasing episodes of prolonged and extensive heat. All of these things are going to be things that we have to address, adapt to. It's very expensive, right? And there's a lot about this that we still don't know. And all we can do is try to work together as a region, because really that's how we operate, right? Folks, at least before the pandemic, might live in one county, transit through another on the way to a third for their job, or going back and forth for schools or whatever it is. And so we really should operate. And I think Measure AA paved the way for this, really, is the region come together and thinking and operating as a region, because the waters don't care about arbitrary lines drawn on a map, right? They don't care at all about that. They'll go where the lowest point is, and they'll find that the quickest and easiest route to that point. And so it's the entire region. It's not just one part of the region and what it does, or even sub-regionally. It's the region together, acting together.
Great question, Ezra. One thing we don't fully understand is how rising sea levels may cause inland flooding far away from the shoreline by pushing groundwater tables up higher as well. Or even where water doesn't get pushed up all the way to the surface, it may cause damage to underground infrastructure that wasn't designed for the presence of water, which is why the Bay Area Council's California Resilience Challenge initiative, which is funded by groups like JP Morgan Chase and PG&E and Resources Legacy Fund and Valley Water, Metropolitan Water District, and Southern California Edison. This is a statewide initiative. We're currently funding climate change adaptation planning projects all across California. And one of them is at the Aquatic Science Center and San Francisco Estuary Institute to study this very thing, the effect of sea level rise on groundwater tables causing inland flooding. So we don't know the answer, but we're currently studying it to find the answer to how big of a risk this is and where the biggest risks are going to be in the Bay Area. So that's one. As for ecosystems, you can look at past historic events of climate change. There have been many in Earth's history. It creates winners and losers, right? A warmer and drier climate will increase the return interval of wildfire, which will put pressure on forest landscapes to transition to chaparral and grassland landscapes, which is already happening in parts of the Sierra. Warmer temperatures will result in a higher snow line in the Sierras. So instead of snow at 4,000 feet, you get it at 7,000 feet. And everything was going to move up upland. This is obviously bad for coniferous forests, bad for cold water fish like trout and salmon, but it's good for bass. So nature has a way of shifting. We just need to make sure that we can survive those changes.
Yeah. Last question for me, and then we'll take some audience questions. One thing I've noticed in my reporting is that there's a sort of vacuum in making regional progress, and that may be changing in the near future. And that's because of the lack of authority and the complexness of cities and counties and agencies, like we've all talked about so far, and then just the high cost of these projects. But people want to do something about this. Like climate change is in the news. It's on every popular news network. What can people do? Some tangible ways to help the process of dealing with sea level rise speed up here in the Bay Area? What's our role as residents of the Bay?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on, is talking to elected and appointed officials and making sure that they understand how important this is to the stakeholders that they represent and are paid to work for. On behalf of, and that they're taking this into consideration. It's fair to ask questions of planning commissions and, are they considering this kind of stuff? Have they considered it? If so, how and why? What are they doing about it? How is it going to impact your community? And just making sure that that is an issue that is communicated to these folks and that they understand that it's important, because elected officials will respond to those issues that they think that their stakeholders care most passionately about. And that's one of the reasons I was really happy to get the invitation to participate in this event. And I'm really happy World Affairs is doing this, is because I think the awareness, even though we're dealing with this all the time, right? Flooding is not new to the region. We're seeing it, on a not infrequent basis when we have king tides and that kind of stuff. This is only going to get worse, but it's still the level of awareness and I think concern by a lot of folks across the region is pretty low. That's why this kind of event and others doing this kind of education is super important. But there's all sorts of ways to get involved and make sure that elected and appointed officials at all levels are aware that this is an issue that the voters that they represent are concerned about.
Adrian, what about you? What are some ways people can help out with this that are worried about sea level rise?
Well, I think Mike had the answer, and I'll just elaborate on it a bit by saying that politicians don't think people care much about this. I'm just going to be frank about it. They care about it. They know that Bay Area voters care about it. The Bay Area is an educated region. Climate literacy is very high in the Bay Area. But when you poll Bay Area voters on it, sea level rise defense is long down their list of priorities. And I know this because I've seen polling on it, and therefore I know politicians have seen the polling on it too. So when we did Measure AA back in 2016, we polled Bay Area voters on arguments that would convince them to invest in the health and safety of San Francisco Bay with an increase on their parcel taxes. And I was quite surprised that protecting their homes and businesses and shared infrastructure from rising sea levels was very low on the list. It wasn't a compelling argument. So if people are asking, how can we help create pressure and hunger and urgency for change around protecting the Bay shoreline from rising sea levels, one thing we got to do is we got to get organized, and you got to communicate to elected officials that this matters to you personally and to your association, your neighborhood group, that this is an issue that matters, and get educated and involved in the several different processes around the Bay that are trying to deal with it, from a local city effort to come up with a sea level rise adaptation plan to regional efforts that are being led by BCDC. But nothing will change unless your political leaders hear that it matters to their voters.
Yeah, and you know, the budget framework that was just put forward and you know, adopted by the legislature, you know, has about $200 million in it, I think, for this kind of stuff for the entire state. And we've already said, just for the green infrastructure here in the Bay Area, we're talking about over $1.5 billion, right? And so per the editorials, both in the San Jose Mercury News and the San Francisco Chronicle, you know, have basically, especially the Chronicle, was really tough, and they called out the governor and Senator Skinner and Assemblymember Ting, who in their respective houses are the folks who are running point on the budget. And so because what was passed not that long ago, about a week ago, is really only a framework, a lot of this is going to be played out over the next, you know, few weeks in terms of what they call trailer bills. And without getting too weedy about that, that means we still have time. We still have time to reach out to, engage, and ask for the Bay Area Caucus, you know, the folks that represent the people who are on this Zoom today with us, the folks that represent you, they should hear from you, and they should hear from you that you think this is something that deserves funding. We are facing an unprecedented budget surplus, tens of billions of dollars, depending on who you listen to. And this is an issue that is only going to get worse. And so the sooner we tackle it, the sooner we set aside funds to address it, the sooner we act, the better.
Thank you, Mike and Adrian, for all these answers. We're going to take some questions from listeners, and let's get a fun one first. What this person says, Ken says, has anyone seriously considered putting a set of locks at the Golden Gate to control for about 4 to 8 foot of rise? I guess, you know, some big ideas, or?
Will Travis has considered it. Will Travis.
Who Travis?
No, I don't know who that is.
He was the former executive director of BCDC. And a few years ago, he had called for a serious consideration of putting in locks at Golden Gate or a dam. And, you know, I think that it didn't really get a lot of traction. The engineering that would be involved in doing something like that along a treacherous, deep waterway with a bridge in the middle. You know, I'm not an engineer, but that I know enough about enough projects that would be, you know, in the many, many, many billions of dollars. And so I think where most people have, everyone that I know in this space has fallen, is that the most cost-effective way of getting the most benefits as possible for the tax-paying public would be to instead utilize nature-based solutions where they exist to provide cost-effective flood resilience protection using horizontal levees and whatnot, and sea levels where we have to, provided they're designed in a way that we can ratchet them up with time as needed.
Yeah, and this idea of these natural solutions, or just solutions in general, Joshua asks, is there discussion of managed retreat from some infrastructures or housing? How would that be implemented? Or is the goal to protect 100% of what is susceptible? And managed retreat is where people have to move and then move them to different places.
Of course. I mean, that is something that we have to consider. I mean, it is just a fact. I mean, as Adrian had pointed out, it depends where you're looking at across the region, right? There's no one size fits all solution depending on where you are in the Bay and what's going to work for a variety of factors that we've already covered. Managed retreat is one of them. And it also, you know, it's not just in the near term, it's these longer range scenarios, which are really worrisome, right? And that is something that we have to consider. Are we going to have to basically move our way up the hillsides here in the Bay Area on both sides? And that's something that we have to seriously consider. Is there a way, as I said, that we can learn from the Dutch and allow water in and build over the water and create catchments, natural and otherwise, to that can accept the water, at peak times and so forth. And so it's not going to be, just one solution. It's going to be, dependent upon where you live, where you work, where you operate. It can be a variety of different solutions, and managed retreats, one of the ones we're going to have to look at.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think our goal, from the Bay Area Council's perspective, certainly, is that we approach this problem with the objective of protecting everything, knowing that we're not going to be able to protect everything, and that those strategic managed retreat decisions are inevitable. Where they're going to be, we don't know yet. But it's important to remember that we're not the Bay Area isn't a snow globe frozen in time. We are a growing region, a dynamic region with intense housing demands and transportation infrastructure demands. That growth has to go somewhere. And our coastal region, as a coastal region, the Bay Area has the best water efficiency rates in the state. And locating housing here next to our jobs cuts down emissions from transportation. So in many ways, from a climate resilience side, if you're going to be incentivizing growth anywhere in California, it should be in the Bay Area. That's where we get the most economic productivity with the fewest natural resources. Yeah. That said, a big challenge is how are we going to do that in a way that doesn't put that infrastructure in immediate harm's way. To what Mike was saying about the Dutch, they've got a phrase for it in Dutch, which is probably 15 consonants with a vowel somewhere thrown in it that I won't be able to pronounce because it's Dutch. But it's make room for water, right? And if you can make room for water in certain strategic places, that's less spending you need to do to keep it out in the places that you don't. So there's certainly opportunities for that in the Bay. The Bay is unique in that, I think that's what separates us from like the New York shoreline, which is completely developed. We actually have opportunities to make room for water too. So, but in the near term, San Francisco is not going to be relocated to Mount Tam anytime soon.
Totally. So how can this is reminding me of some stories I want to work on around like living with water. Like, we have communities across the Bay that are these houses on water. And we do have another question that kind of gets to this a little bit around the desirability. So it's thinking about our bayside spaces in the region. These are increasingly popular or desirable for commercial and residential expansion or rezoning. Our communities need to make trade-off decisions for ensuring we can regreen along the bay sufficiently to address sea level rise, or take that further and maybe live on the water or live with water like you're talking about.
Well, there's a few different, we're getting kind of into territory, not science fiction territory, but ambition territory on what's technologically possible. On the one hand, the old school, there's, horizontal levee projects in the South Bay, for example, that are in the works now. They're going to be protecting disadvantaged communities or low-income communities like Alviso and San Jose that are very vulnerable on the very front lines of sea level rise. But those projects are going in now, and that's going to provide protection there. In other places, there's if regulatory and permitting concerns weren't an issue, I've seen developers come up with floating boxes where you can build a house or a building up to 4 or 5 stories on essentially a floating pad. And then during dry times, it looks just like any other building you'd ever seen before. But when the water comes in, the whole building just floats and rises up. And so there are some innovative things that could be done. I wish I was in the position of picking what we're going to be, what'll work and what's not, and be king for a day. But we'll have to see what pans out.
Mike, do you want to add anything about that around?
I mean, you can look at part of the, yeah, I mean, you can look at part of the Facebook campus there in Menlo Park, right? There's that one building where they actually have, the parking is underneath and the building itself is built on a series of stilts. And this idea about letting the water in, or letting the water come through, it's built with that in mind. It's right there on the water's edge. So, I mean, that's an example, tangible example of a really large building right there in Menlo Park.
We just have a couple more minutes here. Here's a question. I mean, it's worth clarifying. Could you clarify how mitigating sea level rise will slow climate change?
Yeah, so basically, the science is that why it's been called before the greenhouse effect is, in a sense, when you add heat trapping gases of all sorts. Carbon dioxide's talked about a lot, even though it's not the gas that is the best, shall we say, at trapping the sun's energy. Is there's a whole plethora of gases, including methane, which actually is about 80 to 100 times more powerful than CO2. CO2 is the most pervasive, and it stays at its residence time. The amount of time it stays in the atmosphere is in the hundreds of years. So to your point that you mentioned earlier, Ezra, some of this is already baked in. Unless we figure out on a massive scale how to sequester or suck some of that carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it away for long periods of time, a lot of this is already baked in. So when you add these heat trapping gases into the atmosphere, what they do is the incoming solar radiation hits the Earth, it bounces back as a different type of radiation, infrared radiation. And when you have these heat trapping gases there, they actually act like a greenhouse. And a lot of that energy cannot then go back out. And we have this greenhouse effect actually to thank for the fact that we have, historically, over the course of civilization, enjoyed a certain temperature range, which has allowed civilization to flourish. But we have too many of those gases in the atmosphere, then it causes a problem, because it's like the blanket's getting thicker and thicker. And so it's trapping more and more heat inside.
Adrian, any last thoughts before we go on any of this?
Well, is this our sign off?
This is our sign off, and I guess we'll do the call to action again. You guys talked about what people can do to curb sea level rise, or to do that. What should people do?
Okay, a couple things. One, find out who your local and state representatives are, contact them, tell them that it's important. And while you're doing it, if you were to contact state budget chairs, Senator Nancy Skinner and Assemblymember Phil Ting, you could put a plug in for a $300 million appropriation through the budget to the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. That's what our organizations are pressing for, and several other environmental organizations are doing it as well. On the federal side, reach out to Senator Padilla and Senator Feinstein and tell them that you support HR 610 from Jackie Spear to increase funding, federal funding for the San Francisco Bay. And then also, if you're interested in kind of geeking out on the science of this, I strongly recommend going to Sausalito and visiting the Bay model that's managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Before we had computers and digital modeling, you actually had to build a physical model to scale to see how water would move and how water would change if you built infrastructure projects at different parts of the bay, and how it would affect other parts of the bay. That model still exists. It's in a warehouse in Sausalito. It's open to the public, and it's very cool to visit. And I would recommend people go check it out.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mike Milke. He's a senior vice president and head of public policy at the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And you just heard from Adrian Covert. He's the vice president of public policy for the Bay Area Council. Hey guys, it was really good talking to you, and I felt like I learned a lot. And we're gonna go back to Philip Young now.
All right, well, thanks. I know we're short on time, so let me just say thank you to Adrian Covert. Mike, thank you so much. I'm glad we kicked this off. And special thanks to KQED's Ezra Ramiro. I want to thank the audience for being with us. Please join us at World Affairs, as we are going to give you options to take action. Again, be on the lookout for an email from us in a day or so that talks about some of these specific things that our panel has talked about. But I also want you to look out for something later in the summer. We talked about policy stuff, and the things that we're considering for the next in the series is actually how can you get your hands dirty, literally, as we talk about sort of these natural-based solutions. So this combination of policy and doing something on the ground are things that we're experimenting with. So be on the lookout. All have a wonderful evening and have a great summer. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.